Okay, the recording just started. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This is the last day, and today the session is called Objects and Practices. And I'm very excited to be here with you and hosting the last session. So our first speaker this afternoon is Diamantis Panayatopoulos. I hope the pronunciation is correct. He's professor at the University of Heidelberg, and he worked there as a director of the Institute of Classical Archaeology. I hope the information is correct. Heidelberg, where he obtained his PhD, and he's a, let's say, distinguished expert in Aegean Bronze Age, and I think Diamantis would not need more introduction from my behalf. So his paper today is called "Incompatible Exotic Artifacts in the Bronze Age." In the Bronze Age Aegean, and the tension between social practice and affordance. I'm very excited and looking forward to hear your presentation, and the desk and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. And yes. Let me take you in the beginning back to the late 1980s, when I was still a student, engaging in a period when engaging with transcultural interaction was mainly a matter of comparison. A nice yet naive archaeological game of searching for parallels in other cultural regions. Since then, archaeology has made significant advances, trying to overcome such a simplistic approach and reach a basic understanding of intercultural dynamics as webs of significance that should be elucidated by implementing the full arsenal of novel theoretical approaches. After 2 decades of intensive and fruitful discussions, we now enter a new stage, that of self-reflection, by questioning the validity of the theoretical concepts we have applied. And this is one of the main objectives of our conference that focuses on the key issues of border zones, adaptation, and creativity. And the topic of my paper engages with all three of them, since incompatibility is caused by border crossing, emerges during adaptation, and generates creativity. Incompatibility of mechanical parts or digital instruments is a nightmare of our modern globalized world, which threatens equally individuals, groups, and institutions. As an outcome of the constant technological progress, humans depend on complex mechanical devices, hardwares, and softwares. They consist of numerous tiny components which have to be perfectly compatible to each other if we want them to operate smoothly. There are two standard and quite uninspired responses to this modern problem. First, a prefabricated solution, that means the use of adapters, and second, a negative response, that means discard of the incompatible device. In antiquity, similar problems of incompatibility were evident, though quite different in nature and scale. They existed mostly, if not exclusively, in a transcultural setting, and to be more specific, in the case of things that happened to cross cultural borders, thus acquiring a new biography and mostly a new function in a rather different context of use or consumption. The main difference to our modern time is that such incompatibility problems were not perceived as a problem, but rather as a challenge, generating a creative response. In traditional archaeological thought, incompatibility as a phenomenon of cultural interaction was not a major issue. Actually, it was not an issue at all. Only the new awareness towards the materiality and agency of things and the aroused interest in issues of perception or social practice shifted slowly the attention from the traditional focus on typology, perception, or social practice and provenance to phenomenological and praxeological aspects. This was a huge methodological advance which questioned a very common silent hypothesis of traditional research, according to which an object was imported together with its function. This simplistic argument, which actually suggested that an ancient artifact traveled across cultural borders with a sort of an operating instructions manual, explaining the foreign user how to handle with it, was based on selected classes of objects or phenomena of transregional entanglement. Perhaps the most prominent among them is the symposium or banquet, this ancient aristocratic habitus of dining and drinking parties enjoyed while reclining on couches, which is very well documented at least since the early first millennium BCE. The diffusion of banqueting paraphernalia from the Near East to early Greece and from Greece to Italy has been quite often regarded as an evidence for the diffusion of this specific social practice. In this case, the dominant opinion was and still is that what came first was an interest to adapt a foreign social practice, a cosmopolitan way of life, an interest or desire that led then to a high demand for the symposium set, which had to be imported or to be imitated by local artisans. I actually have nothing against this traditional scenario, which in this specific case seems to be quite convincing. What I find problematic is taking the symposium premise as a general explanatory model for understanding why foreign things traveled and how they were used in their new social setting. Archaeological data from the context of transcultural interaction between the Near East and the Aegean in the late Bronze Age suggest quite the opposite, namely that most of the objects which entered a new cultural context were used or consumed by individuals who either had no idea or did not care about the original function. In this setting, problems of incompatibility relating to the material or design of an artifact are undeniable, and the challenge for the archaeologist is to explore the manifold ways with which these problems were tackled by ancient people. Now, the inevitable question is how to approach this problem, and to be honest, how to approach it in a fresh way without simply repeating what has already been said in the last 2 or 3 decades. The only way to do that is to start from what previous research failed to evaluate in an adequate way, the connection. Previously, scholars engaged with connections mainly in terms of the people, places, or things that came in touch to each other. In practice, they conceptualized connections from their endpoints, rather than from the point of the connections themselves. Yet, there can be no doubt that in order to better understand the historical significance of transregional interaction, we have to think of connections as mediators rather than mere intermediaries. In his explication of actor network theory, Bruno Latour stresses that, I quote, mediators transform, translate, distort, and modify the meaning of the elements they are supposed to carry, end of quote. This is actually what connections always do. They do not merely bring their endpoints in contact, they interject themselves between that which is connected. In other words, connections do have agency. There is no better example for illustrating this point than the invention of the telegraph. It was the telegraph as medium or connection, the factor that determined the very essence of this form of communication, and not the human agents at both ends of the wire. The information to be sent should be brief, to the point, stripped of linguistic ornaments and unnecessary remarks. In a quite similar way, we have to acknowledge that the open and unpredictable sea was not just a void, but a transforming element of Bronze Age transcultural encounters. Aegean societies never experienced a massive presence, but rather a fine dosing of foreign ideas. What I am suggesting here is that we need different explanatory models for evaluating terrestrial and maritime interconnections. Let me give you an example. The blind imitation of Egyptian stone vases in the Levant, on the left, and the total discard of their design in Minoan Crete, on the right, which are two rather predictable cultural responses when we consider the agency of the connection. The high degree of circulation of Egyptian vases in Levantine markets made the serial production of copies a very successful marketing strategy, while the low degree of circulation of these vases in the Aegean and their incompatibility with local forms fostered creativity, which dramatically transformed their design and function. As we see in this example on the right, they were converted to shapes that were better suited to local needs and or aesthetic demands by modifying the vessel's mouth, surface, and base, removing handles and giving them new attachments. What you see on the right is an Egyptian globular vase made of brown porphyritic basalt, which was found at the Minoan palace of Katozakros, where in this piece, the import's original design was radically transformed to a bridge-spouted jar, a typical Minoan shape, after the Egyptian original was turned upside down. In this transcultural setting, it becomes quite apparent that function is not an intrinsic property of things, but a cultural construction. And here's the point where the notion of affordance comes into play. This term, a very well-known one, which in the last couple of years became a key issue in archaeological discourse, has not only a certain hermeneutical potential, but also some obvious limitations. Following James Gibson definition, affordance refers to the potential uses of an object as defined by its physical properties. The object's material of manufacture, texture, surface, and above all, its shape afford a specific function or functions. And this concept can be compared with what Michael Schiffer describes as performance characteristics. The problem with this understanding of affordance is that the normative definition of a proper function or functions based exclusively on the materiality of a thing cannot bring us forward, at least not in the field of archaeology. Instead of defining affordance as an absolute property of materiality, it is much more sensible to regard it as a relational property, something which includes the perception, reaction, or agency of the users. This relationality is very well expressed in the term social affordance, which is, by the way, very close to Ian Hodder's fittingness, namely the best evident function of an object within a network of human and things. And here you see the illustration in the second page of the book by Ian Hodder and Tankle, with a piano in a Mesolithic village, which is totally out of place because the way in which objects come into play totally depends from their context, the specific entanglements of human and things. In other words, in the context of Bronze Age Mediterranean connectivity, affordance was not an intrinsic quality of things, but happened after their translocation into a new cultural context. And because the original functions were mostly illicit or irrelevant, the original affordance was reverted to what one might call a default mode. This default mode of function or affordance is recognizable in several classes of imported objects in the Aegean. One of the most important among these classes is foreign seals. In the Near East and the Aegean, two quite different ways of sealing things have developed, ultimately leading to a total incompatibility. In the Aegean and in Anatolia, seals were of a stamp type, which were impressed on a wet clay surface. However, in many regions of the Near East, after the Neolithic period, seals were primarily of a cylinder type, which instead was rolled over the damp surface of the clay. Despite the fact that on both sides of the Mediterranean, both ways of sealing were known, mostly through imported items, it is interesting that in each case, only one of them was implemented. Most of the Aegean or Near Eastern bureaucratic systems of the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE operated either with stamp or with cylinder seals and never with both. What we have are two existing orders, two clear-cut and rigid systemic arrangements for the use of this class of objects. This sharp divide between the Aegean and Near Eastern seal administration looks as if we had a population of Mac users and a population of PC users, a clear case of technical and mental incompatibility. Now, the interesting question is what happened when in the 2nd millennium BCE, cylinder seals were regularly imported into the Aegean. How were these incompatible objects treated in the context of the local bureaucratic systems? The most common reaction was a total neglect of the actual function, and to be more specific, of the sphagistic use of these objects. Here, one should underline that the social value of seals was not at all limited to their function as sealing instruments. As we know, they were also appreciated as luxury items for their aesthetic and symbolic qualities, as jewelry or insignia of authority and power. One of the most impressive group among them is undoubtedly the cast of 36 Eastern cylinder seals made of lapis lazuli and further unengraved pieces of the same stone from the Mycenaean Palace of Thebes in central Greece. These superb collections of foreign cylinder seals was appreciated primarily because of their exotic and precious material and not because of its seal design or function. Thanks to the keen observations of Edith Borada, who published this group a while ago, we know that the total weight of the mostly cassite style seals and the unengraved pieces with similar proportions, a total of 496 grams, closely corresponds to that of one ancient mina, the Babylonian weight unit, suggesting that they came to Thebes probably as a shipment, perhaps a diplomatic gift, of lapis lazuli rather than a group of cylinder seals. The classification of this assemblage as a group of cylinder seals, which from a typological perspective is certainly correct, does not necessarily help us to comprehend its actual significance in its place of destination. These pieces were either worn as jewelry or most probably just kept in the treasury of the Theban palace as a shipment of exotic material, being part of the economic and symbolic capital of this prosperous center. It would not be far-fetched to suggest that they were defined and obviously named in Mycenaean times, not by reference to their function, but to their material. What here emerges is the non-functional characteristic feature of things whose new function and social significance was compacted or condensed in the fact of their mere materiality. The evidence at hand can be regarded as the rule, showing that even after the frequent importation of Near Eastern cylinders, in the Aegean the latter were never employed as bureaucratic devices for authorizing or brandmarking an object. Yet, as in every rule, there are some exceptions. In our case, in the corpus of the Lady Bronze Aegean nodules with sealings, more or less 3,000 pieces, these exceptions are only three. The first one is a rolled impression of a Cypro-Aegean cylinder seal on a nodule from Knossos. The second example is more interesting. It is the impression of a cylinder seal of the Akkadian period on a nodule from the site of Aietriada on Crete. Interestingly, the 4-inch cylinder was not rolled as one would expect in the case of such, such seal, but stamped on the nodule, like a stamp seal, only a part of it. The local user implemented the cylinder seal as a stamp seal. The third case is a recent find from the excavations by Athanasia Kanta in the Anatakis plot, possibly a part of the religious center of Knossos. A nodule with also, as in the second case, a stamped, not rolled impression of a Cypro-Aegean cylinder seal. How can we evaluate this quite unbalanced evidence? We see three different ways of coping with incompatibility. The first way was to ignore the function entirely and appreciate the thing's material presence and high value. The second was to let the object dictate the user to adapt a foreign practice and roll the seal over the clay surface. And the third was to use the object in a way which was quite awkward to its original affordance. Instead of a conclusion, I would like to return to something which was highlighted by Peter van Dommelen in his keynote and by other participants of this conference. In our constant quest to understand ancient realities, the issue of the analytical scale is crucial. If we agree to favor in our new narratives an imic perspective, then we have to focus on the micro or local context, which is undoubtedly the most decisive historical setting for the phenomena we are studying. In an era in which communication was not detached from the arduous transport of humans, things, and materials, the significance and presence of the outer world was limited. After several decades of irritation caused by anachronistic concepts, such as the international style and its derivatives, we can now operate with new analytical categories which reflect in a more lucid way the complexities of historical reality. Cosmopolitan localism, a new term implemented in social sciences, appears to me much more fitting since it provides a more balanced and accentuated view between the character of foreign presence and the importance and agency of the domestic context. And finally, what about the three key terms of our conference? Contrary to previous studies of transcultural encounters, which stress the different modes of adaptation, I would agree with Karl Knappett, who, following Lane, suggests that one key mechanism for innovation is exaptation rather than adaptation. Exaptation in biology, a shift in the function of a trait during evolution, and in archaeology, the adaptation of an object for a completely different function, a sort of creative misappropriation or misuse. As Knappett has stressed, innovation occurs through new attributions of functionality, and innovation is nothing else as condensed or applied creativity. And what about the borders? No matter how we want to name them, in the last 3 days of our own conference, it became once more apparent that they are perceived in much the same way in which modern architecture perceives borders, namely as ambivalent entities which are fluid and permeable. They operated not only as dividers or separators, but also as thresholds and in-betweens, places at which two different worlds interpenetrated, a place of symbiosis which creates a dynamic relationship between contradictory elements while allowing them to remain opposed. In our troubling times, such an understanding of borders could be an insight whose relevance for modern society can be much more important than its scientific explanatory power. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diamantis, for this very inspiring paper. We have a couple of minutes for questions. I'm sure that someone here. Can you sorry, Diamantis, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes, here we go.
Yeah, applause, virtual applause. So let me check the chat. No. Okay, I see, sorry, I lost probably the order, but let me, Yana Minarova.
Yeah. Hi, Diamandis. Thank you very much for this lovely talk, as always. I was just wondering, and I apologize for my ignorance on the knowledge of Mycenaean or in general Aegean seals and sailings, but I was wondering, do you have any attestations for kind of like pseudo inscriptions on these objects? Because this is quite interesting topic for the Near Eastern archaeology, because we do have, especially from, let's say, border zones of the cuneiform world, we have several groups of seals and sealings where actually the inscriptions actually do not make any sense, especially those inscriptions in the legends. I know that usually inscriptions on seals in the Mediterranean world are rather short, but is there anything like that also attested in your realm?
Well, I think you mean only the imported pieces from the Near East and not local
No, I
imitations.
mean the local ones, like
In the local ones, there is no inscription at all, but this is actually a general phenomenon. They're actually, with the exception of only one period in the history of this class of object in which we have inscriptions on seals, the two media, writing and seal images, were totally separated.
Yeah.
So that's why it's, of course, an interesting question, but we have to do with a very consistent attitude as far as the implementation of writing and imagery was regarded. So no inscriptions at all.
Thank you.
Perfect, perfect. And personally, Diamantis, thank you so much also for introducing in our discussion the concept, the very interesting concept of exaptation, which was, let's say, introduced many years ago by in biology, and it could be really interesting maybe for the final discussion. Okay, Thomas, please. Yeah, your microphone, Thomas, you're muted. I can't hear you. Can you?
No.
Peter, can... no, I'm sorry, Thomas. Something is not working with your... Okay, so Francesco, please.
Yes, thanks a lot. That was very interesting talk, and I really enjoyed it. I quite liked the figure of the sea as an unpredictable, transformative mediator. That was really interesting. I wondered how, if you see some connection between the perspective you have outlined in a way and other similar perspectives that have been laid out recently, ranging around the use of terms such as globalization and the like, and another thing on a slightly more critical note, I was wondering, do you think we really always need to have a focus on innovation? There has been a lot of interest in archaeological theory on innovation as a theme, and there are obvious historical reasons for that. And I wonder what you think about that, if it is really the main key to which we should explore these issues. Thanks.
Well, I'm a bit surprised by the second question. I could imagine that there is someone who would question the importance of innovation as an analytical concept, but I find it interesting. It's not only an archaeological, but a more general problems in humanities, how we approach innovation or creativity, and the divided lines between both are rather blurred. So I would say, yes, it's interesting if we use the appropriate analytical tools. Otherwise, we are not going to get any new insights. And to the first question, and I thank you very much because you mentioned the term globalization, and some of you certainly already noticed the similarity between the cosmopolitan localism concept and globalization, because both of them relate to something very similar. I think that cosmopolitan localism is a bit better, more precise than the globalization concept, which is rather anachronistic if we take the global very strict, and we want to apply it back in the Bronze Age.
Thank you very much both for the discussion. Thomas, very quickly, you want to try again? No, maybe you
can write it.
You can write on the chat if you want, Thomas. Bogdan, we have 1 minute for a question, please.
I'll ask it, and if it's long, let's leave it for the discussion. Thank you very much, Diamandi. In the beginning of this fantastic paper, we saw this picture. It's the nightmare, you go to the States and you don't have a computer. So the incompatibility is something negative. But I'm still very impressed by the way Kerstin used the concept of translation yesterday. And I think, don't we need a certain incompatibility in order to be able to translate an object? And as we said yesterday, that everyone can appropriate. You understand, you don't understand, you appropriate. But in order to translate it, you have to possess some knowledge over some knowledge, and then this creates immediately a vertical relationship between you and the others. So could it be that incompatibility is something which was looked for? Thank you.
I find it very interesting, your attempt to relate incompatibility with translation. And I would say I see a potential in our field to, when we deal with these terms, to try to make them more precise and applicable, not only in our field, but also in other fields. And I would say incompatibility is the problem. Translation could be the response. So we could have a relation in 2 different stages. But now I'm thinking only after your question and the talk by Kerstin Hoffman yesterday, whether translation actually presupposes something more than knowledge of the original function. But I have to think about that. And whether we can just use translation as the next step after an incompatibility problem.
Thank you very much. I think you all rose a lot of interesting points. Maybe we can come back later in the final discussion. Sorry, Thomas, maybe we can, we now have to move on. We can go back to this points after. So thank you again, Diamantis, for the amazing paper. And then we can go back to Sicily as we were already there yesterday, and now we are going back to archaic Sicily. And the next paper is by Eric Hiesler. He's professor at the University of Innsbruck, and previously he obtained a PhD in Zurich when he worked on the Monte Jato excavations, and then he taught in Bochum. And his main research is about early Iron Age and Archaic period in the Mediterranean, and especially in Sicily. And his paper is called Diverging Consumption Scapes Around the Crater in Archaic Sicily. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo.
The desk is yours.
Thank you. It's my great honor and pleasure to participate in this very inspiring conference. So a very warm thank you, and especially to Peter Pavuk. Like no other medium, the crater as a wine mixing vessel stands for the circum-Mediterranean appropriation of Greek culture in the course of the so-called Grand Colonization from the 8th to the 5th century BC. This suggests a comparison with the Coca-colonization of today. In both cases, we are dealing with cultural biographies that describe the rise of a product to the status of a consumer icon through which a particular ideology of identity is absorbed. On the other hand, it provokes local ressentiments or even counter-consumption reactions through its expensive production history. In the first part, all this will be illustrated in the light of Coca-Cola or Coca-colonization. This analogy is intended to sensitize to the possibility of a production and consumption history of the crater in the second part. Therefore, I aim to trace the life of this product from the idea behind it as an analog of Coca-colonization as a first stage. The penetration of the crater and its impact into new Mediterranean areas will follow as a second stage, and the multi-local responses to this craterization, as I would call it in analogy with Coca-colonization, as a third stage. The last stage must here be limited to archaic Western and Central Sicily, which, despite their geographical proximity, could hardly have reacted more differentially to the phenomenon of craterization. The analog. Behind the consumption history of Coca-Cola emerges an imperialistic landscape of a modern American way of life, provoking a wide variety of local reactions around the world. In post-war Germany, for example, the consumption of Coca-Cola acquired iconic significance for teenagers who wanted to distance themselves from the bourgeois fussiness of their parents by Americanizing their life culture. On the other hand, with the Luo people of post-colonial Kenya, a downright Africanization of Coca-Cola came about, as Michael Dietler has shown. Here, the trademark of Western fast food culture was served as an expensive Bordeaux wine at festivals and only given to the most important guests. The case of Inca Kola is quite different. This imitation Coke from Peru, produced in 1910, consists mainly of the extracted flavor of the lemongrass bush, which Peruvians call herba liusa. Probably because of this unmistakable native taste, the Peruvians remained loyal to their Inca Kola and still prefer it to Coca-Cola today. Americanizing Coke lore of Santa Claus is successfully countered by native Peruvian folklore, which promises to support the authentic experience of one's own local identity. This kind of consumer resistance results from a local and traditional consumer environment, but at the same time, it represents a reaction to Coca-colonization and therefore constitutes a further stage in the cultural history of Coca-Cola. Of course, the Mediterranean of the first half of the first millennium BC is not comparable to the Mag world of today. Nevertheless, in particular, the work of Michael Dietler has shown how fruitful an analogy can be drawn between Coca-Cola and its ancient counterpart, the mixed wine. Its material icon, the crater, reveals through its consumption and expansion in the archaic Mediterranean a historical phenomenon that has some equivalences with today's assumed Coca-colonization. The Greeks call this circum-Mediterranean phenomenon kraterizein and understand it as a Hellenizein. This means the appropriation of the Greek language and Greek way of life. First stage. As the material world in general, the crater, as part of it, helps to translate living and consumption habits into everyday reality and incorporate particular ideologies of identity. Its shape alone is entirely in keeping with the principle of form follows function. With its waste mouth and ample body to the crater is designed to dilute the wine drawn from the amphora with water or enrich it with aromatic additives. Already in the Homeric epics, the poets never tire of emphasizing this process in formulaic verses. With the emergence of the Greek city-states in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, this ideology of the delighted banquet became closely linked to the function of the crater, to diffuse the alcoholic effect of the wine by diluting it with water. The cultural technique behind is the art of the right measure, in which all the companion socialized young men within the culture of the Greek symposium. Mastery of this art distinguished the aristocrat from the Philistine and the Greek from the barbarian. Drinking wine akratos, unmixed, was accordingly considered to be wine bibbing in barbaric style, tending to end in a noisy uproar. However, the crater had a second meaning that was equally crucial to the identity and self-understanding of Greek aristocrats. As a rule, craters were precious objects that could be desirable guest gifts. Thus, the Spartan king Menelaus explains to his foreign visitor from Ithaca, Telemachus, quote, "Of all the treasures, as many as lie here in my house, I give you the most beautiful and honorable gift, a well-fashioned crater for mixing wine. It was given me by the king of Sidon, the hero of Idemos, who took me in as a guest on my returning home from there. This gift I would gladly honor you with." End of quote. Craters are thus not only an accompaniment to aristocratic hospitality, they function as well as materialized symbols of guest friendship. This pre-contractual character of craters is also underlined by Herodotus' story of the Spartans' gift to Croesus in the shape of a colossal crater, which was intended to seal the military support given by the Lydian king by the Spartans. As Joanna Luke has already pointed out, the crater connects Greek and non-Greek elite members into a trans-Mediterranean entanglement through guest friendship and hospitality. Second stage. In the latter 8th century BC, Sicily was thrown into the orbit of the crater as a vehicle of consumer identity, a result of the first Greek settlements in the east of the island. For Megra Hiblea, Adam Rabinovitz identified as many as 32 craters in deposits of the first 100 years of the colony's history. In the 7th and 6th centuries BC, the center and west of Sicily were also affected by this craterization through Greek settlements founded at Cirla, Camarina, Himera, Selinonte, and Acrogas. As a result of these Greek foundations, there were also identified contacts in Western Sicily between powerful Greeks and native clans. As Thucydides records, this could even lead to intermarriages, which were most likely intended to consolidate the obligations of already existing guest friendships between Greeks and natives. Finally, following such social lines of connection, from the second quarter of the 6th century BC onwards, more and more Greek craters came to be found in the houses and cult centers of the indigenous elites of Western Sicily as materialized symbols of hospitality. With the arrival of the Greek craters and the politics of Greek guest friendship, the indigenous were not automatically Hellenized, as researchers had long assumed. This is evidenced by the many crater replicas from the 6th and early 5th centuries BC produced by inland potteries. In Western Sicily, as Matthias Harnes demonstrated, the indigenous workshops did integrate the new vessel type as a new symbol of trans-Mediterranean networking as best they could to the local tradition. This is showcased by 16 locally made craters from the banqueting rooms of the later cake house on Monte Iato. They undoubtedly reproduce the shape of the Greek colonnade crater, but their matte painting with purely curvilinear decoration remains exclusively bound to the tradition and taste of the local population. Paradoxically, This indigenous manifestation of local authenticity took place in an architectural and socio-cultural ambience that testifies to a high degree of Hellenization. Thus, the later cake house, with its prestigiously furnished banqueting rooms, 2 stories, tiled roofing, and monumental dimensions, embodies a high-tech Greek architecture. A comparison with the residential complex of a prominent family on the neighboring Monte Maranfusa makes the escape between sophisticated Greek architecture and the local way of life exceedingly clear. In keeping with the Greek lifestyle in the later cake house, by contrast with the one on Monte Maranfusa, people no longer sat at the banquet as had been the old custom. Instead, one lay on a couch in the attitude of the elegant symposiast. In addition, there is a surprisingly high number of first-class black and red figure pieces from the potteries of Athens. Moreover, these Attic imports, which depict almost naturalistic scenes from the mythical and everyday world of Athens, were accompanied by 16 dipinta. This means that the wine was taken from the Greek amphora, mixed in the matte-painted local craters, scooped with a matte-painted jug, and finally poured into the red and black figure drinking vessels. This scenario makes the adherence to the traditional decoration of the dipinta craters even more apparent as a deliberate act of an identifying expression of local authenticity. Thereby, the curvilinear decoration was not a matter of lack of ability, but rather a deliberate stylistic choice, as is proven by the geometrized animal and human representations on the contemporaneous matte-painted jugs. This harking back to local authenticity as a kind of resilience contrasts strikingly with the Greek culture presence inside the banqueting rooms of the later cake house. This apparent paradox conceals a deliberate policy of both ends, in the sense that, on the one hand, the adaptation of the Greek vessel type of the crater was aligned with the standards and semantics of Greek hospitality politics. However, at the same time, there was a will to signal loyalty to one's own ancestry through the local traditional decorative idiom. The latter is impressively demonstrated by the Karatriskos K 2998. This Karatriskos was found in the residential complex west of the Hellenistic Peristyle House II, which was ritually abandoned around 250 BC. Despite the archaic appearance, the local appropriation of an early Hellenistic drinking vessel type is evident. However, what catches the eye, especially in comparison with the later cake dipinta craters, is the emblem-like wavy band, abbreviated to a W, which also decorates the lower handle zones of the early Hellenistic Karatriskos. These Ws are a specific feature of the Athenian colonnade craters, probably representing something like a local identity marker. This local identity marker passed down on Monte Iato through the 6th century to the 3rd century BC and experienced a revival when the mountain underwent a renewed phase of monumentalization and strong Greek influence under the Carthaginian epicracy. 3rd stage. The craterization of central Sicily in the 5th and early 5th centuries BC seems to have been entirely different from that of Western Sicily. Significantly, here we no longer speak of an appropriation, but rather of an imitation of the Greek models. For not only do these specimens imitate the type and symbolism of the Greek colonnade crater, at the same time, their matte painting, by contrast with their West Sicilian counterparts, is very much based on Corinthian and Attic models. This strongly Corinthianizing and Atticizing pictorial idiom goes hand in hand with epigraphic evidence of a powerful Greek influence. First and foremost, this applies to the imperative bebe, drink, appearing on a black glaze cup that came to light in Argentina. Though this invitation to drink wine was scrawled on the cup in Greek letters, the word itself is of course not Greek. Nevertheless, the reference is to fashionable practice in Greek banqueting circles as shown by hundreds of Greek drinking formulas painted on Attic cups. The dipinta hydria from Montagna di Marzo is also highly revealing. Its decoration in places shows rows of Greek letters that had been painted on before the firing. The inscription on its mouth can thus be deciphered relatively easily. Geloios akas eratai. The Chilon desires Aka. This sentence was responded by a second inscription on the opposite side of the hydria, Oimachos demistotai, but Oimachos paid her. This inscription not only documents a certain Greek literalism, over and above that, they testify to Greek symposia and a mode of a social culture that is upmarket. The waste painter alludes to the sexual and erotic component of Greek symposial pleasures through the inscriptions, and at the same time jokes about the expected behavior patterns of banqueting symposiasts in their dealings with female companions. So, what else is indigenous about this hydria apart from the proper name Aka? Even if prevailing local indigenous tastes were followed in the making of this hydria, the inscription on this vessel is clearly aimed at a Greek-speaking male audience participating in a symposium in the manner of the Greeks. In Central Sicily, by contrast with Western Sicily, the Cratarization was accompanied by far-reaching acculturation to the modus vivendi of the Greeks. The crown witness for this Hellenization process is the already mentioned hydria of Montagna di Marzo, which unites indigenous ceramic tradition with the highest aspirations of Greek convivial culture. Just as the dipinta craters of Central Sicily reveal the best possible adaptation to the Greek model, the craterization that resulted there also involves far more than adapting Greek ideas and Greek cultural standards. Conclusion. In Central Sicily, craterization circumscribes the geographical expansion of an identity-defining consumer landscape that firmly establishes a cultural boundary between Hellenized persons and non-Hellenized people, even in the indigenous hinterland. Due to the military and territorial expansion of the two colonies of Gela and Akragas, being civilized or being Greek had become an attractive life formula for the indigenous elites, promising social success. Consequently, craterization in the case of Central Sicily corresponds entirely to the modern analog of Coca-colonization. On the contrary, in Western Sicily, we find only very depleted traces of craterization, which is much more suggestive of an indigenization of the crater, showing an analogy with the Inca Cola and the consumer resistance of the Peruvians mentioned earlier. Consequently, in contrast to the Hellenized hinterland of Gela and Akragas in Central Sicily, the interior of Western Sicily is no longer a border zone in the proper sense. It is a mountainous landscape with its own centers of gravity that serve the empowerment of local elites, of course, with the Greek partners' help. Moreover, in this context, the Phoenician coastal cities of Western Sicily should not be ignored. As an alternative and competitor to the Greeks, they increased the power play favoring indigenous chieftains. Therefore, this particular historical framing makes the inland of Western Sicily a zone of its own right and does not lead to the acculturation of the indigenous elite, as is the case in the hinterland of Akragas and Gela as a proper border zone. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eric, also for saving the perfect timing, and you saved 1 minute more for the discussion. I really enjoyed this idea of characterization, and I was thinking about. I have a lot of questions. I was thinking about our case studies in the Northern Adriatic, but I don't want to. I really would like to have to hear some questions from the audience. I'm sure that you have many. Peter, yes, please.
Yes, this will be more of a comment. I just can't resist. Like, craterization is definitely the expression of the conference.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, like what you were showing. For a second, I thought that you are showing my early late Bronze Age pottery in central Greece and northwestern Peloponnese, because it does exactly the same thing. It even looks similar. I was really speechless. So the things happen again and again. And one of the words which at the back of my mind is the word resistance. And not necessarily like aggressive resistance, but like deliberate choice that I do appropriate something and I don't. And especially this negative decision is kind of fascinating to me because it's much more hard to grasp, because when they do take something over, we see it. But and when they don't, we may guess like they didn't know about it or they didn't want it. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about regions where the characterization is not taking place, like in northern Italy. But no, Bogdan, please, short comment.
A short comment, yes. It refers to the passage from the Odyssey you referred to, which is fantastic with this crater, which is of course blah, blah, blah. But if you use this for the publication, I would advise you to start half a page earlier, because the beginning of the story is very interesting. Menelaus first gives horses to Telemachus, but Telemachus says, I can't take them. Ithaca is too unfertile. And then he says, okay, they take this crater. And I think this is fantastic because it shows that at least is some, or the crater was the best present. You know that it would go whatever the recipient is.
Thank you very much. This is a great idea, really. Thank you.
Yeah. I was also thinking about the idea of translation that here could work somehow. Francesco Iacono, please.
Yes, thanks a lot for this paper. I was just wondering, I mean, I quite like the general framework that you have described to us, but we do now know that there is a very long-standing tradition of alcohol production in the central Mediterranean. We do have the first evidence from Sicily coming from the Copper Age. We do have potentially mixing vessels already during the Bronze Age. Even in Sicily, we do have very high pedestal bowls that are present in much of that part of that side, let's say, of the Italian peninsula. So I was wondering, do you think these potentially could have had an effect on these processes?
I mean, one problem is that we don't have evidences, botanical evidences for wine drinking in the interior of Sicily. At least the first are in the 6th century, as I know for the moment. There are such proofs in Montepolizzo, and we also have on Montiato first layers of the late 6th century with grapes. And the second is that we have organic residue analysis of these craters, which I showed you. There we find also traces of beer mixing together with wine mixing. So you can also ask if the entirely indigenous tradition is beer drinking and not wine drinking. This is there are a lot of question marks for me, but the most important thing is that the profile, the form of the colonnade crater is completely new. It's a different thing to the preceders in Bronze Age. It's not this kind of mixing bowl, or like the Bronze Age, like Topsos balls, and in this kind, it's completely different. And so it's more a semiophoric item, and not how should I say, an icon like the Coca-Cola bottle. The Coca-Cola bottle has forerunners at the long term, but you will identify a Coca-Cola bottle on the 100 different bottles with one eye catch.
No, I agree that there is a process of homogenization, very much. I mean, it's true. But I was just wondering. Yeah. Yes, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question. Professor McSweeney, please.
Hello, hi, thank you. I just want to congratulate everyone and say how much I've enjoyed the last few days so far, but I had one small question, Eric. I really enjoyed that, and I love the idea of categorization, but the implication is that there is some contemporary acknowledgement or recognition of different types of processes going on. So if categorization is a process which is acknowledged, a category of activity, which is acknowledged in antiquity, do you think that we are dealing with ancient categorizations of different types of activity, or are these different categories of activity that we are imposing on the evidence? I'm sorry if that was not articulated very well.
It's not a small question, it's a big problem. And I'm switched between both perspectives, between ancient terminology and modern theorization models like globalization. And I'm searching for a middle ground to reconstruct local environments. Let me say in this manner.
Yeah, thanks so much. Kerstin, very briefly, if you can. I can't.
We don't hear you.
I can't hear you, Kerstin.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
that's better.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. But I was wondering about the colonialization. I always, when I discuss it with cultural anthropologists and all these people, they have the idea that there was an attempt of cultural imperialism. And this concept is used very closely with this idea of cultural imperialism, and also perhaps failed cultural imperialism. And if you use it in the way with not an equivalence, but an equation, then you always have to deal with the question if there was the idea of a cultural imperialism behind it. And this is always the discussion about agency and who are the actors there in your play. And this, I think, I would closer look at this kind of stuff, because there, I think, in the local dimension, there are quite differences. And there's a big question if you have this kind of cultural imperialism for your time.
Yeah.
This is only the question, and it's not the problem within archaeology. I think we always use it in the globalization discussion, more or less. But if you go beyond archaeology and discuss it with other people, then we have always this negative connotation in this concept and from the original concept idea.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think Peter is maybe another point for the final discussion, like the globalization, localization, and colonialism. And I am afraid we have to move on. So thank you so much for the amazing paper, and also for the very interesting questions. So let's go back again in this shifting between different regions. Let's go back again to Emilia-Romagna, northern Italy, northeastern Italy. And the next paper is by Erika Camurri, Dominic Lukas, and Jan Kisela. Erika studied in Bologna and working on the amazing excavation of Monte Bibele and Monte Renzio, and I'm very pleased to introduce them. Dominic is a prehistoric archaeologist and expert in the late Iron Age period, but also he worked in Germany and Turkey, and especially he joined the Çatalhöyük project as a database developer. And now he's working, if I'm not wrong, in as a PhD researcher at the University of Chicago. And Jan Kisela, he's one of the co-organizers, and he's working in Prague. And probably there is no needed for more introduction. So their paper is Betwixt and Between: How Latin Material Culture Relates to Multi-Ethnic Societies of Later Age Emilia-Romagna, Italy. I don't know who is speaking.
I will start sharing my screen.
Okay.
This one.
So with no further ado, the desk is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. In this contribution, we will return to, as I said, to Po Valley, more specifically to Bologna and its surroundings, to discuss the period immediately following that tackled by Andrea Gauci and Giulia Morpurgo 2 days ago. That's here. Based on written sources, the Etruscan domination of the Po Valley was uprooted by Celtic invasion at the very beginning of the 4th century BC. And the Celts, specifically here the tribe of Boii, remained then the masters of the region until they were themselves defeated by the Romans in the turn of the 3rd and 2nd century BC. Apart from this basic outline, late mentioned by Strabo, let us understand that the pre-existing populations, Etruscans and Umbrians, outlived the Celtic dominations of the region, maintaining the consciousness of the ethnic status. Apparently, throughout the Celtic period, various individuals or communities were able to maintain their pre-Celtic, whatever it means, identity in opposition to or in combination with the Celtic one. Although the specifics of anything of this is absolutely inaccessible to us, we may try to gain some insight into this apparently extremely complex situation through the study of material culture of the period. As a matter of fact, the archaeological record of the 4th to 3rd century BC Emilia-Romagna can serve as a prime example of a mixed or Creole or bricolé or hybrid culture, choose whichever of these terms you prefer, in which the elements of the Latin culture of Transalpine origin and historically associated with the Celts intermingle with those of local Etruscan or Italic tradition. This presence or mixity of the Latin culture in this region, in sites like Bologna and Marzabotto, is a long-established fact. However, the key milestone in this study is the research of the settlement and symmetry of Montevibele in Bologna's Apennines, beginning of the 1980s. In Montevibele, the earliest 5th century, 5th, 4th century graves are furnished with pure Italic grave goods, and in the mid-4th century, some Latin brooches and weaponry start to appear, and from second half of the 4th century, the symmetry is characterized by a mixed furnishing in which the female and some male graves maintain their Italic character, with stress put on feasting and body care, while in other male graves, Latin type weaponry constitute the most eye-catching component. This situation gave rise to a quite straightforward interpretation of a small Etruscan community joined by some individuals of Celtic origin, resulting in an ethnic and cultural mix. Such direct interpretations were challenged in 2000s by stressing the famous problematic relation between ethnicity and material culture. For instance, the anthropological analysis done on Montevibele showed that the distinction between Celts and Etruscan was, in fact, due to age of the deceased. In this way, however, the research got kind of stuck with a statement that we are most likely dealing with mixed communities using mixed material culture and Celto-Italic culture, and that this is the fact more or less in the entire region. This admission is, well, the admission that we cannot go beyond this statement is to some extent correct, but at the same time, it is an impasse which we should strive to break. And more importantly, it basically, by subscribing it, we basically implicitly imply that for us, the only key in which we are willing or able to read the archaeological record is ethnicity. So exactly the thing which we rejected right now. And so therefore in this paper, we will try to step back, forget about peoples for a moment, and have a look simply at the way the people of Emilia-Romagna of the 4th, 3rd century dealt with the material culture. Well, in order to do so, we due to the state of the research, we have to limit ourselves to study of burial record. And so we selected the 204 available and usable tombs of the studied period. These come from several sites, quite various in their typology, from Bologna, the former Etruscan capital of the region, Marzabotto, an Etruscan town fallen in decay in the 4th century, Montebello, which we have talked about at length above, Casalecchio di Reno, cemetery of purely Latin character, and several other small cemeteries of the region. The study of the material culture included all the objects put into graves and the ways they were used, they were dealt with. But we in particular focused on a distinction between 2 or 3 principal cultural components. These 3 are, first of them is the Latin culture, specific with the very specific kinds of jewelry, weaponry, highly distinct art, and the best benchmark for in the region is the cemetery of Casalecchio di Reno, which I mentioned before. The other major component here is what we label Felsinian tradition. So what we mean with it is the continuity of the local Etruscan culture of the 6th and 5th century BC. And it manifests itself mainly in the pottery, which undergoes no significant formal technological changes between the 6th, 5th, and the 4th and 3rd century. And there are also some types of brooches and other implements such as distaffs, which remain the same. Another feature, more importantly, carrying on the tradition of Felsinian culture is the more broadly Mediterranean stress put in burial rite on wine consumption and body care. And in order to verify the continuity of these Felsinian traditions into the Celtic period, we supplemented the table with another 92 tombs from Bologna of the 5th century to see how they compare. So Bologna as the principal example, and another local 5th century cultural component worth attention is a cultural group defined on the grounds of a few cemeteries in Western Romagna, and traditionally identified by some with Umbrians. We, on our part, prefer labeling them as Romagna or Imola group. Though this group is seemingly marginal and disappears soon in the 5th century, the burials of this cultural group feature some elements which will appear in Emilia in the following period, such as mortars, courseware beakers, spiral bracelets, pilum-type javelins, or multiplication of feasting services in the burial in grave woods, and therefore we further enlarge the database with 77 burials from the cemetery of Imola Montericco. Yeah, here it is. Dominic?
Okay, I just share, right? Okay, can you see that?
Yes, it's working.
Wonderful. Okay, so as already mentioned by Jan, we are approaching the question of the distribution of material culture by attempting to analyze these objects and their attributions by means of social network analysis. After attending the paper given by Zamboni and Ciccolani, our paper could be seen in communication as we attempt a similar goal. I'm very much looking forward to discuss potential affinities and creativities later. Making use of social network analysis in archaeology, as has been seen already in different examples, is among else based on the theory that we can model relations of objects in a similar way as it is being done concerning the links between human actors. This, of course, brings questions to the fore in how far it is actually possible to map objects and their relations onto supposed past activities that these objects engaged during human practices. Social network analysis is a method has, of course, the benefit that its implementation is rather straightforward and the potential to create impressive visualizations that allow for direct communication about such complex issues like constellations of material objects and the role these played in the interactions of human agents of the past. the past. In a forthcoming paper produced together with Angus Moll and Ian Hodder, we developed a model that allowed for the direct integration of data models with the development of technologies at the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük. By using a network model, the entanglement of distinct technologies and their influence on the development of further technologies could be studied. Our present approach can also be seen in the vein of opening the method of social network analysis to shed light on the complex interaction of object distributions and their value for past human practices in the context of burial, quite logically for the realm of rituality. Based on the material, retrieved from the 409 burials, as mentioned, we assembled a table containing standardized information on objects, but also their position in relation to the buried individual, other objects in the same context, or traces of manipulation indicating ritual practices. Identical attributions in different contexts then allowed to encode the affinity reflected between different burials by similar objects or contextual information. Encoding is achieved by means of adjacency matrices that are a basic tool used for the production of network models. In the example, you can see the presence of a latent fibula and its deposition above the head of an individual of two contexts, Bologna Benacci 962 and Bologna De Luca 30. In the adjacency matrix, this affinity is marked by summing two similarities in between the two burials. The matrix is used to produce the graph showing a bidirectional edge between the two nodes. The data consists of 409 burials, as I mentioned, with 257 columns containing the attribute information. Burials are related by weak links, low values of affinity, or strong links. The strength of the links in the end determine the closeness of the burials, and as we will see, bringing contexts in closer relation beyond the limits of different necropolies or other types of boundaries we could conceive of. In a first step, we analyzed the relationship of the contexts in question, only looking at the object distributions. So this is the model of the 409 burials, considering only the object distributions. The image shows a network of burials indicating clusters of relationships and in opposition to less similar contexts in other clusters. So for example, we see here a first cluster that groups around the burial Monte Bibile 88, which for the object distribution is the most central node. The different colors in the image indicate different necropolies, hereby indicating the respective affinities. Another cluster can be identified around Monte Bibile 65 in the upper half of the image, in connecting to chronologically earlier burials, showing the possibility to analyze relationships beyond the temporal barriers to analyze diachronical relationships. Another cluster is identified around Bologna Benacci 953. In this visualization, a minor mode, as we only consider object distributions now, but this will change. Monte Bibile 88 is a burial with primarily italic material distribution and objects used for spinning wool. At the same time, Monte Bibile is traditionally attributed to the Latin component present in the area. Moreover, the burial is linked to primarily latent contexts like the purple-covered Casalecchio di Reno here. The model shows the integration of different aspects of the Latin component on different necropolies, distinguished by different modalities, their affinities based on different sets of attributes. Let's have a look at Bologna Benacci 953. The distribution here is set apart from other burials of the same necropolis, as it shows strong affinity to burials at the site of Monte Bibile containing arms and items attributed to the use during symposia. Let's have a look at the change when we look at the practices. So the cluster changes its aspect. Here we have two main clusters, again around Monte Bibile 88, which is the right-hand side. But now the second most important node is 953. Moreover, the general, the distribution of objects is similar to the one we saw by looking only at objects, but now more burials are have affinity with the Bologna-Benacci 953. So it draws them closer together. The distribution in the pie charts, we can now see what happens with the integration of the practices, so of the positionality of objects in relation to the individual. This somehow, if we look at this, is then allowing for seeing the configuration of the cluster, showing that there is a certain importance of inhumation, and the different types of services that Jan will talk about just in a second, show also a very distinctive configuration of this cluster. And when we look now at the difference that we can see with the same analysis for Montebelluna 88, we see that there is a different distribution of inhumations and also a different use of the different aspects, how the service, the funerary service can be configured. Same is valid talking about the position of the different objects in the service.
Okay. So to take up from here, we may go on and try to look at the archaeological interpretation. We may extract from all this. In order to begin with, we may have a look at, once again at the scheme of the network of simply the objects, in which I draw your attention first to the left-hand side graphic, in which you can see this quite clear concentration of yellow elements in the center. Those are the most antique, the oldest object, the object of the 5th century. Those which we took for comparison, 5th century elements. What's interesting to see is that these are there are two principal components which depart from them in two directions. And on the left-hand side, there is Montebelluna and principally Montebelluna and similar sites. On the right-hand side, there is mainly Bologna. Bologna, 4th century Bologna, the 3rd century Bologna is also seen intermingled with the rest of the of the 5th century objects. This is best shown on the left-hand side, where you can see the cemeteries themselves plotted. So in this first graph of the objects only, we see a clear distinction between Montebelluna and Bologna as two very opposed entities. When we complement this view with the other network, that of the rituality, we can see, as Dominic mentioned before, that including the rituality, what changes is the distribution, and we have these two extremely strong elements, mainly Bologna-Benacci 953. Which links to itself a wide range of burials, which are, however, extremely heterogeneous. Well, the reason for this is that Bologna-Benacci 953 is a very rich, very well-furnished grave, which combines in it the elements of symposium and elements of warfare. And thus both Hercynian and Latin elements. And in fact, the burials which are linked to it are, on the one hand, the 5th century element, which have basically no other characteristics but the symposium and drinking vessels. And on the other hand, in gray and green, there are burial graves either from Montebelluna of the 4th, 3rd century, but at the same time from Imola, Montericco, the 5th century peripheral burial ground. What's interesting in both of these graphs, we see and what the graves which concentrated here before are more or less in this area now. What's interesting to see now is that if we are looking for the Celts, so for the Latin material culture, there's no group of Celts. There is no clearly Latinian group, and the Latin characterized graves are distributed all over the place. So there are those orange, those violet, and the pink ones. You can see them all over the place. Another thing I find quite interesting to see is that Bologna of the 5th century, the yellow one, and Bologna of the 4th century, the turquoise one, tends to cluster together, cuddle together, while on the other hand, we can see that, for instance, in this path, but also in this direction, Montebellune, the Celto-Etruscan side of Montebellune, find considerable affinities with the 5th century burial grounds in Romagna. What conclusions can we draw from this? In the first place, we can state that there is, yes, we are observing well-mixed Celto-Etruscan, Latin-Etruscan culture, but this mixture is not random. This mixture is well dosed according to necropolis. So there are well-established patterns of mixing the two elements from one necropolis to another, and these codes seem to not to be established at the beginning of the 4th century BC, but they show some continuity from the previous phase. The Celts disappeared, and in this way we should state, or we should realize that identifying any clear-cut cultural groups in this cloud is hardly possible, and rather than talking about vaguely defined Celto-Etruscan culture, which was usually defined based on Montebellune and the Bologna Meraci 953, which is the only such grave in Bologna. Rather than this, we may speak about multiplicity of models in which completely identical objects present in all sites, were in every site combined in another way. One more thing to mention. All of this happens in an area of 200 square kilometers, and among our 4 key sites, there is at the most 20 kilometers of distance. So this multiplicity of choices and recipes happens just one next to the other. So I think we can leave it with it, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you, both of you, and also Erika, for this very, very interesting paper. And we saw again, for the second time, we saw an attempt to analyze a massive amount of data through network analysis. I'm sorry, we are running a bit late, so I'm afraid we have only room for 1 or 2 questions, if any. Let me see. Boris? No. Andrea.
We certainly have some time if there are questions.
Okay. So Andrea Gauci, please.
I'm here. Thank you very much. I appreciate a lot this presentation. Very interesting, also for the analysis of impressive quantity of data. Only one small question about, I missed the information, the role of weapons within the funerary context, what is this role in your analysis?
It's one of how many? 190 elements taken into consideration.
265. Yes.
Because I think this is a very well. There are some elements that probably has a different role within the funerary rites, and weapons is one of these. Probably, if I look to the rites of the 5th and the rites of the 4th and 3rd century BC.
Definitely, it can be very well seen in the graphs. The graves, this fan of graves on the left hand side or on the top, they are usually weapon graves, which
okay.
Well, in the rituality network, you can see basically the distinction between weapon graves and the feasting graves.
Okay, sorry, I missed only these things. Sorry. And one other brief question: did you try to put out of the analysis some very important or, well, I can say anomaly, very impressive graves as the Benacci 953? Did you try to do this thing?
To do the analysis without the grave?
Yeah.
It would be fun, but no.
So put out all the rumors, the possible particular graves, and see what happens.
That's a good idea. We will try that immediately.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Boris and Martina, please.
Thank you very much for this amazing presentation. I have to admit, well, in the latest period, well, from our perspective, what we think might be problems. Well, if you look at, I don't know, Monte Carlo algorithms or Hamiltonian graphics, we tried to use, we had always the same problems that when looking at complex assemblages, we saw that generalized graves, the graves you call generalists with huge amount of material, then actually form the cores of clusters because they are related to more elements than the so-called specialized graves with fewer elements. But it's those specialized we normally interpret as carriers of identities. If you have weapon grave where we have only the Celtic weaponry, okay, this is clearly attributed as being a Celtic. But if he has all this Etruscan drinking stuff inside, he becomes a generalized, automatically more related. So my personal problem in trying to interpret situations like this is that basically correlation, a lot of correlations do not correspond to what we interpret as strong reflection of identity. But basically, in mathematical terms, it's the, as I said, Hamiltonian, Monte Carlo, all Bayesian statistics. The problem of all these approaches is that the degree of belief of what we select as analytical category is based on a priori knowledge. So this becomes a circular argument. If we identify a priori something as carrier of information or identity, basically the statistical model confirms that this is in the core of correlations. So I have to admit, with our regional small attempts, we became frustrated, but good is what you managed to present is basically because you have the large number of graves included in the studies. So this is, I guess, the only way coming out of the problem. And luckily you have the big number of graves to be analyzed. We unfortunately don't. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's a key issue in this kind of analysis. Yes, please, Dominic.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Please.
No, the interesting thing is actually that so what we actually did not want to say is that the identity of whatever cultural context is rooted into this one tomb, into this one burial, but it's actually the collective distribution of aspects that it shares with the nodes that go around it, so that are drawn to it. That give an interesting indicator, but again, this is not an identity indicator. It's just a way of measuring different components. Let's call them cultural components for now, and how they interact with each other. And what the identity then is maybe the person or the individual that plays with these different aspects, and therefore it's not really a cultural identity. It's more a creative effort.
Thank you so much. I really would love to go on and go deeper in this methodological also issues, but we are running late, so it's the moment for the last paper of this 4 days conference by Marko Ditsdar and Asia Tonk. Marko is a director of the Institute of Archaeology at the University of Zagreb, if I'm correct, and he's an expert of early Iron Age and especially Latin periods in Croatia and in the Eastern Europe in general. And Asia, I think we met a few years ago in UCL London for in the ethnicity conference. She's working as well in the University of Zagreb as a postdoc researcher, and she's an expert in pottery, amphorae, and also let's say funerary evidence in that regions. So their paper is it's called The Southern Connection, Tracing Mediterranean Influences in the Late Iron Age of Southern Pannonia. And the desk is yours, please.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay, I will stop the video because maybe it will be better for the presentation to work, and start sharing my screen. Okay, can you all see it now?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. Yes, well, thank you, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation, especially to Jan, our dear colleague. I have to apologize in Marko's name. I don't think he is able to connect in the end because he's on some excavations, and today is also national holiday here in Croatia. But nevertheless, I hope the presentation will still be interesting for all of you. So we are going to the Southern Pannonian region, which is characterized by the major river valleys of the Drava, Sava, and Danube. Today, they represent national borders, but they served as important communication routes since prehistory. And imported items found in this area and some neighboring regions will be considered here as markers of trade routes, but also contextually in light of their adaptation to local custom, or in general as reflections of influences from the broader Mediterranean area, both Hellenistic or the Italian part and the Adriatic basin. And the aim is to show through particular finds and their contexts the potential of some minor routes and various communities of the north-south axis that may have played a more important role in late Iron Age networks than usually regarded. And also new data will be mentioned that sheds a different light on certain aspects of the trade and communication network used during the final phase of the Latin period. So, tracing the Hellenistic influences in the Southern Pannonian archaeological record of the final Hallstatt and early Latin period relies mostly on items belonging to jewelry. And for this occasion, let's start with new data coming from the area of the major communication hub, the Danube River Basin. Some interesting recent finds come from the Baritual cemetery in Lovas in western Sirmia, which you can see the position here, today on the eastern border of Croatia. The inhumation grave, unearthed in 2019, dates to the so-called Churuk phase corresponding to Latin B1. And the grave contained, besides a badly preserved iron knife and an iron fibula, also a pair of bronze early Latin zoomorphic fibulae on the shoulders, a type relatively common in the Eastern Slavonian Sirmia region in this phase, but also many transparent amphora-shaped, as well as smaller biconical dark blue, green, and ochre glass beads around the neck belonging to a necklace. Some of them you can see on the picture. This is, of course, not a bead. The amphora-shaped glass beads are especially relevant in this context, since the origin of this shape, widely discussed in many publications, is usually traced to the Mediterranean region, and they are widely distributed from the southeastern Alpine region to the entire Carpathian Basin and throughout the Balkans, with a separate concentration of finds in the lower Danube and eastern Transylvanian region, probably oriented towards the Black Sea production area. And the examples from Lovas, shown here on the map, and those from southern Pannonia most probably originate from Hellenistic Macedonian workshops. Dissociation of glass and amphora-shaped is beads and amber or coral beads is found in many assemblages and graves. Coral, without doubt a material coming from the Mediterranean, is present as part of necklaces or also as inlays for fibulae and bracelets, like in Pecine, which you can see here on the pictures. And both types of glass and also coral beads feature as part of female jewelry sets in the final Hallstatt and early Latin of southern Pannonia as reflection of contacts with the south that continue since the late Hallstatt period, when imported items appear, for example, in rich graves of the Central Balkans. The techniques of filigree and granulation used for manufacturing objects of precious metals and gold and silver found in these contexts also testify to the southern Macedonian influences. Sometimes can be interpreted as imports, such as the silver or gold boat-shaped earrings from the first half of the 4th century BC, although for some examples, the local production in Southeast Pannonian workshops cannot be excluded. The earrings are found in sites in the Sirmian region, present here on the map, but also in eastern Bosnia, in Glasinac, or in central Serbia, and further south again in the Vardar Valley and other sites. And their production, if it was local, was surely heavily influenced by the styles and techniques introduced through the exchange of items and ideas with the south. One of these probably locally produced items developed under influences of Macedonian types are bracelets with snake-like head endings. One such bracelet appears in the very interesting group of grave finds from Bogdanovci in the vicinity of Vukovar in Sirmia. The finds from Bogdanovci, unfortunately not retrieved as closed assemblages, include various beads of amber, coral, and glass, also the silver omega pin, which is an item of Balkan origin, also testifying the connections with neighboring regions. But the most interesting find is a small silver cylindrical box decorated in the filigree and granulation techniques. The box finds analogies in Židovar in the Banat region, which is dated to late Latin, but also in Plana in southern Herzegovina and in sites in the Vardar Valley, with also analogies in gold. So once again, the Vardar Valley stands out as a communication hub connecting south-north, but this is of course already a well-known fact. The Sremska Mitrovica graves, also dated to the Churuk phase, contained, besides glass and coral and amber beads, also fragments of a bronze cup, which is highlighted by Martina and Boris Kavur already in their publication, that is probably a type of kilix or a kantaros, so a type of symposial vessel frequently found in Macedonia and northern Greece during the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. And this brings us to another category of southern provenance, the bronze vessels that in this period rarely appear in southern Pannonia and should be considered luxurious items and possibly a sign of individual, personal connections of the upper class members of the interested communities. A very relevant context is the one from Karaburban in Belgrade, the well-known grave 22 that contained the ovoid situla and the cup. And both vessels belong to the 4th century BC Macedonian production and most probably reached Karaburma as gifts from the south, as argued by Martina and Boris. Same could be perhaps proposed for a number of other vessels mapped here and shown in the distribution of Hellenistic vessels in this whole and wider area. But several pieces found in continental contexts could be also attributed to Etruscan workshops, in any case rather far from their point of origin. So Etruscan vessels are famously present, for example, in Mannersdorf in Austria, in grave 13 dated to early Latin. And a Simpulum with bird-shaped ending of the handle and a strainer from Sisak are added here to this group of finds of Etruscan origin, although their dating could be somewhat even earlier, since analogies are found in material dated also from the late 6th to 5th and to the 4th centuries BC. Another vessel that shows foreign origin or influences is the ceramic big jug from a grave in Pecine, dated to the end of the 4th century BC. And if it was not a direct import from the Macedonian area, as the bronze vessels from Karaburma, the item was surely produced under a foreign southern inspiration, since such forms do not typically occur in the latent pottery production of the region. Similar finds have been recorded on the Adriatic coast and sometimes referred to as Corinthian oinohoi of the 6th and 5th centuries to 4th century BC. But a significant group of big jugs from the Central Balkans should probably be regarded as a local production based on the pottery tradition of the area, as argued by Maja Parović-Pešikan. On the other side of this north-south route, some traces of Celtic presence have been recognized, suggesting that movement of people and transfer of ideas circulated in both directions. So on Lake Ohrid in the Deboit cemetery, among numerous graves with Hellenistic fineware and jewelry, some contexts stand out due to the presence of weaponry, lances and helmets, whose origins is traced to the Celtic milieu. Especially significant is cremation grave 58, containing what can be seen as a full Celtic Middle Latin panoply, a sword with chain and lance, and shield boss and helmet. The grave ritual also suggests the Celtic origin of the deceased, identified by Mitya Gushtin as a probable warrior, a mercenary that served in this area for the local leader. The characteristic Latin ceramic shapes and wire fibula of Middle Latin scheme found in the layers of the Kale Krševica site in the South Morava Valley have also been attributed to Skordiskan presence, once again showing this movement to the south. And some other finds can also be interpreted as arguments in favor of a Celtic presence in the south, like the anklet from Oreshani or the walnut-shaped anklets from Isthmian in Greece. But rather than any proof of military raids, they are to be interpreted as in the context of exchange of goods and mobility of people between the two worlds. When discussing the presence of Celtic warriors on Lake Ohrid, Mitya Gushtin mentioned also the depictions of warriors, and among them also the warriors with long swords depicted on a stone urn from the Yapodian area from eastern Bosnia. This offers insights into another possible route of introduction of southern Hellenistic influences to the Sava, Drava, and Danube confluence, the one that connected the Adriatic coast to the hinterland by the regions of Lika and the Una Valley, where several sites yielded proof of connections with the southern Adriatic. Among warrior and weaponry depictions also mentioned by Gushtin are the belt plates from Gostil on the northern shores of Lake Skadar in Montenegro, with best analogies from Ošanići, a prominent hillfort settlement of the Daursi in southern Herzegovina, and 5 more examples come from Prozor near Otočac in Lika, an important Iron Age site attributed to the Japods. The warriors, lances, and mythological scenes show a common origin or inspiration if the Prozor examples come from another workshop. But only one belt plate from the latter site was recovered in a close context, the grave which you see here, which nicely illustrates this mixture of influences in these so-called in-between regions. The grave contained a bronze belt plate with figural decoration, besides head-shaped buttons, which are present in the southeastern Alpine area and in the hinterland of the North Adriatic. But also, besides the belt plate, a ceramic vessel also points to the southern regions. And the vessel, with traces of painted decoration in the upper part, can be defined as a late Canozan, so an Apulian production, with analogies shown here from the Museum of Split. And a few more vessels from Jezerine and Ribic, both cemeteries located in the Una Valley, also could be attributed to the late Canozan production. Another grave with mixed context is this one from Ribic, which you see here on the map, which contained the Hellenistic style cantharos found alongside a brooch with 2 knobs, which is a Celtic influence, and a characteristic apodic brooch with double spring and large amber bead on the bow. The Cantharos is similar in shape to the group with thorn decoration and could be ascribed to the late Hellenistic production from the mid-3rd to the mid-2nd century BC. And both this grave and the one from Proser are also significant in showing an important aspect, the incorporation of elements from diverse sources in the creation of a specific identity. A ceramic rithon in the shape of a cow or bullhead from the grave in Ezerine has analogies in Istria and Dalmatia and can also be attributed to the Gnatia style production. Its presence in a grave with what's probably a prominent member of the local community shows once again connections with the Mediterranean world, but also the process of embracing external symbols and incorporating them in the local funerary rite. A vessel with spiral decoration found in Ezerine and shown here can be compared perhaps to the one from Sanski Most, which is shown here on the map, and attributed to the Pharos production, with another option being the Alto Adriatico, so the northern Italian production of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. In any case, the Adriatic production reached inland up the Una and the Sana river valleys. All of this shows that the point of origin of reflections from the Mediterranean world is, of course, not restricted to the Macedonian area or the southern Adriatic Hellenistic centers. The mid and south Italian centers of pottery and jewelry production, as well as influences from Etruria, mentioned already in the case of bronze vessels, are also relevant for the late Iron Age period. The coastal area, in particular the Quarner region with the important center of Osor, and also Una Valley and Lika, served sometimes as intermediaries between the Italic and the Pannonian world on the edges of the Carpathian Basin. A possible Etruscan inspiration has been suggested for the pendants and brooches with female busts manufactured in silver, present in the coastal area, but also in Sisak, although medallions with similar female heads also come from Hellenistic centers of the southern Adriatic, such as Oshenice and Budva. Nevertheless, the distribution of another group of anthropomorphic pendants made by pressing thin silver sheet in matrices confirms a connection between Sisak and the Una Valley sites, with similar finds occurring further east, in the Židovar Horde and also in Hrtkovci in Sirmia. A possible inspiration from the Mediterranean world has sometimes been suggested for these objects, that were surely produced also locally in southern Pannonia, as demonstrated by finds of matrices in Sisak. Whatever their origin, their distribution supports the idea that the Una Valley community, much like Sisak, was a meeting point of various routes, granting to the members of the local elite access to various rare or luxurious objects. Coming to the late Latin period and the transition from the 3rd century BC to the 1 AD, this period is marked by shift in trade and communication patterns as a reflection of changing historical circumstances connected to the expansion of Roman power. The distribution of Roman Republican bronze vessels is already a well-known aspect of the late Latin period that shows the possible adaptation of foreign items into the local symbolic and ritual world, as shown by the analysis of vessel use in grave contexts done by Mariana Egri and Avril Stoyu. The rich assemblage of chance finds from the Kupa River in Sisak, possibly deposited as votive finds, include also numerous bronze late Republican vessels of various types. And this is not at all surprising, given the importance of Sisak, later ancient Sistia, as a communication hub and a meeting point of north-south and also east-west communication routes. So this was the status of some years ago. However, new finds from intensive field surveys of multiple sites in the area of Vinkovci, ancient Sibale, in eastern Slavonia, show a very different picture that challenges the traditional concept of bronze vessels as items exclusively associated with elite graves or most prominent settlements. In fact, although some grave concepts, such as the grave 92 from Belgrade Karaburma, can be indeed attributed to the members of the local upper class, the overall number of new examples would rather speak in favor of a vaster distribution among the local inhabitants. The types present on these sites are those already documented in this area and in general common forms in the late Latin and Central European contexts, mostly strainers and simple pescate type Idria jugs. On same sites also appear fibulae such as now Almgren 65 or Nauheim types. However, the number of sites in a restricted area is quite high, which you were able to see on the map. So this is the most significant new aspect in the distribution of late Republican bronze vessels. Some sites have already been identified as important Latin D settlements, such as Vinkovci Blato and also Mirkovci Malat or Andrijaševci Gornje Njive. However, given the current state of research and the finds so far collected, not all sites can be considered as important late Latin centers. This could indicate a much more complex settlement pattern within the late Latin Skradiskan cultural landscape of Eastern Slavonia and Sirmia than previously thought. But already the identification of the open-type central settlement of Blato demonstrated that Opida, or better said, fortified settlements, were not the only social, trade, and political central places during this time. The question as to whether only the most prominent members of society had access to these long-distance cultural connections and imported goods remains open, since for now we have no grave finds that could give some more answers. With the beginning of the Augustan era, Roman pottery appears in southern Pannonia, and sporadic items of military equipment indicate the decreasing importance of Roman military units and service of the members of the autochthonous community that ultimately contributed to the spread of Italic customs during the complex and quite controversial still process often indicated as Romanization. At the same time, in the already mentioned sites in the Una Valley, richer graves contain imported vessels such as an Ako beaker from Jezerine and fibula and jewelry like Alesia and Tistel brooches shown here in the Ribic grave, indicating that the local population embraced once again new items to create an identity that functioned in the new circumstances. Since this conference mainly addresses various concepts of adaptation and interaction between communities on different levels, from individual to large-scale trade contexts and similar, the diverse archaeological data presented here is used as a starting point for some broader conclusions on the nature of these contexts and integration of influences in the identity and cultural concepts of the local communities. Starting from the final Hallstatt and early Latin period, the imported glass and coral beads have been incorporated in the late female dress in southern Pannonia and Transdanubia. Simultaneously, the items in precious metals manufactured using jewelry techniques that originated in the Hellenistic world are embraced as final products, but also as inspirations for the creation of local products such as bracelets or earrings. Considering the presence of beads in rich female graves, it would seem, however, that the introduction of such items and practices relied on individual contact between communities rather than on large-scale trade connections. The practice of exogamy seems to be particularly important in this context as a way to confirm established cultural and political connections, as argued already by Aurel Rustoiu. The appropriation of imported items that can be considered luxurious, such as the bronze vessels, or particular ceramic types, such as Rita, points to their integration into symbolic expressions of a particular community. By its use in a burial rite, the specific item, such as ceramic riton or the bronze citra in Karaburma grave, obtains a specific meaning to the members of the local community. The symbolic meaning changes and shifts through time and space according to different social contexts and needs and varying circumstances between the place of origin and the recipient, as well as through various phases of development of a particular group. This has been already proposed for the introduction of late Republican bronze vessels during Latin D and the integration of these vessels in the social context relevant for the local Celtic society. The graves from the Lika and the Una Valley with imported vessels and belt plates or silver appliques also show the creation of a particular, somewhat hybrid expression in which elements from various sources come together. Given the position of these communities between two great culturally and socially different worlds, the Pannonian with the Carpathian Basin on one side and the Adriatic, both Hellenistic and Italian world on the other, this shouldn't be surprising. These communities, as well as Sisak or, for example, Ostra in the Kvarner region or Donja Dolina in the Sava Valley, should be regarded not just as border zones that served as intermediaries. More likely, they had their own position within the contact and trade network and flourished exactly because of this ability to connect and take from both worlds. Finally, new Latin finds from Eastern Slavonia demonstrate that our ability to explain processes of cultural adaptation on the basis of imported finds relies frequently on incomplete data, and new paradigms have to be considered. The increase of imports speaks in favor of a steady market of supply and demand, not just limited to upper elites. It would seem that some new circumstances were in place and that the society rather quickly adapted to them in ways we cannot fully grasp at the moment. We are therefore yet to solve such issues, and in doing so, try to overcome the geographic, historic, social, and political borders within our own mind. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aja, for this overview of Southern Pannonia. Very full, well done, and full of information and data. I think, Peter, we have a few minutes now, 5 minutes for some questions.
For
Please,
sure.
if anyone does do something. I think this region is, let's say, a paramount for connectivity and adaptivity, probably also. Some Latin expert would like to to say something, to ask something. No?
But I'm missing my Latin expert.
Right.
No, of course, if there are any questions, we are more than happy to answer. Try to answer.
Maybe I can take advantage of my position and ask you, can you say something more about the little amphora glass beads? Because I remember we have in Spina, in some funerary and also in the settlement. You said, probably I missed that point. You said that probably they are coming from the Mediterranean world. You know, the white beads,
Yes.
the small amphora-shaped beads. Do you know something about the origin of that shape?
I think that Martina and Boris will probably be better in answering that. But they are, I mean, they are really have been discussed in many publications so far, and their origins has been also sometimes thought to be Italian or also Macedonian. So the opinions are not always the same, but the distribution really covers this Eastern Adriatic region very good. So I agree more or less that that came from these regions and not from the west. And also they appear on many sites in the coast. So I think that this is the most probable way of introduction of them to this.
No, in the west are present, but not so widespread as in the Eastern Adriatic.
Yes.
And fortunately, I don't know if there is some archometrical analysis, but I don't think so.
Yes.
If we may.
Yeah, please.
So let us return to several papers back today, where translation needs. Yes, there are translation needs, but they depend on the motivation. And obviously the motivation was rather positive or negative, as we have seen, and it was different in these territories. The biggest problem with what you mentioned now, these amphora-shaped glass beads, is that, well, according to the few analyses that were done yet on the assemblages from Slovenia and Croatia, demonstrate that the glass is of Eastern Mediterranean origins, basically of the Macedonian composition. And the problem is that now, looking at those trade routes, we have much more on the Adriatic, which is obviously the future Via Ignatia Macedonian trade route to the north. But then in the central Balkan, Morava, Vardar, and Sava corridor. But the great thing is that the motivation was the biggest here. The largest quantity of those finds come as, of course, Jan would know perhaps the best, from Brno to Budapest. It is those Celts who wanted this material, that those trinkets the Macedonians produced and traded massively to the north. Of course, there's several big assemblages come from southern Italy. So obviously this was a set all present, but the motivation for their acquirement was obviously different in this big mosaic. What I would also like to just another short comment to the overview we had is the problem that too often authors trying to present this relation between Archaea Macedonia and the Macedonian production in the 4th, 3rd century BC and the trade to the north, ignore the simple fact that what Marco and Asia have demonstrated, that between the Celtic worlds and the Archaea Macedonia, there's a lot things going on. And in numerous discussions, also quoted here, we can hear that those Hellenistic type pottery in the southern Pannonian basin is a copy of the Greek pottery, which is basically a rhetorical escape 100 years back. Simply because there's the Macedonia and the Paeonian world in between, and this pottery doesn't look anything as the Greek, but it is obviously the exact copy of the Hellenistic Paeonian ware, which is a very nice defined identity. Well, at least look in the pottery. This different from the Macedonian, different from the Celtic in the north. So sometimes we just have to look at what was stressed before, these micro identities in a big hot spot as the Balkan is and was. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those addictions. And I would also go back, if I may, to the idea of exogamous marriages that has been mentioned by Asia before. I do believe absolutely that exogamous marriages have been a crucial strategy and sort of adaptation strategy all across prehistory and protohistory, as Philip Stockhammer demonstrated clearly. My only point is that, and probably this is another point for the final discussion, my only point is that we cannot or we should not let's say address or hypothesize this strategy only looking at the material, the grape goods, because it's let's say it's slippery, and every time we have bioarchaeological data, they demonstrate that there is no match between the provenance of, for example, strontium analysis. There is no match between the provenance of people and imported or non-local grape goods. So I really do believe, even in our case study in northern Italy, I do believe that exogamous marriages were really common, but we just from a, let's say, a methodological point of view, we cannot infer them only taking into consideration the, I don't know, non-local jewelry.
Yeah, I agree. Of course, that is surely not the only possible explanation. I'm sorry that Marco isn't here, because he's really dealing with these female identities in his project right now, and but for sure it's something relevant that we are we are able to trace this female dress and female graves in this period more than the male ones. So some explanation has to be considered for this. Yeah,
I agree. Marek, one last question.
It's only a remark. I would like to actually add something what Kavurovci told us, and they are definitely right, because we have to, if you want to understand this region and these possible communication routes, we have to have a look on the microregions, developments in the microregions, because we have a similar situation also in Ohrid, and it's not only these graves you showed and which was already published by Gushtin and Kuzman, but there is at the moment unpublished ceramic which was identified as a Latin period ceramic in a settlement context. So these are actually the points that are only after the understanding what's happening in the microregions we can gradually reconstruct the possible roads, because I'm not I mean, I'm working in Ohrid, but I don't think that we are dealing with Celts there or something like that, like Gushtin is assuming according to this male warrior graves. That's a short remark.
Yeah. Okay, I think, Peter, we can close this session, and so I give you back the screen and the microphone. And thank you very much, all of you, for the amazing last session.
Okay, thank you, Enzo, and thank you as well to everybody presenting today. It was really vibrant day, and I was partly considering to give a 10-minute break now, but maybe now we are on the move, so let's continue. I would like to not to summarize the whole conference, but to say something general at the beginning, and then we shall see how the discussion develops. And it seems that there are still questions to be asked. Let's see whether there will be the relevant speakers still around to answer them. It was very interesting to me how the whole conference in the end developed, because and I think it's also interesting for the overall discussion that we had in the last days, how people understand or how would we write. Okay, we wrote, or I wrote, the call for the papers, and we, like, to be clear, this is not an ad hoc conference. All of you were targetedly invited, and it paid off because it was an incredible experience. But it was interesting how basically each of you understood the call in his or her own way, and there was this all the discussion about the borders as such. And admittedly, I haven't thought about the borders at all, but it's nice how the topic got its own life. And yes, the sessions individual, as I said, like, we needed to structure the conference somehow. And so sometimes it worked out better. Sometimes the papers were more mixed. And we plan a publication, and I think it would be a pity not to publish this collection of papers. And eventually, for the publication, the papers will be restructured slightly differently, because now we know more specifically what the people were talking about. At the same time, I would like to point out that there is no pressure, like publish or die. Like, if you don't feel like submitting the paper, there is no obligation by the participation in the conference. And as I wrote before, we have been considering some foreign publishing houses, and the main one now fell out of my mind, Equinox. But equally, I'm tempted also with Sidestone Press, which is publishing very nice books, and they are quite dynamic. And so we'll see. I will approach the publishing houses with the outline of the publication based on the conference, and we shall see what the response will be. And based on that, I will contact you again with possible guidelines, etc. To start the discussion a bit, as you noticed, I was taking notes for the conference, and I was hoping to offer some bigger picture, but admittedly, I'm already a bit tired after the 4 days, so my concentration is not not at the highest points, but I will simply go through some of my notes, and I think that you will simply catch the ball, and some further discussion will develop. But principally, the main aim of the conference was to grasp a broader region and also a broader chronological span, because we pose similar questions, but it is not only that we give different answers or differing answers, not necessarily one being better than the other, it's simply a different approach. But it is also the material that we work with, and the type of borders and the zones and centers and peripheries and this kind of stuff. But that, while on one hand it might have seemed to be kind of a hodgepodge of all possible things, I think that is the point of this type of conferences, to see what other people are doing, whom we not necessarily would be discussing with. I'm sure that people from Lisbon do not meet often people dealing with Central Asia, and vice versa. And so for that reason, that was already important. One major point, though, which kept being repeated throughout the papers is, let's call it epistemology, or like we use various terms, and it is always very important to define quite clearly what we mean by the term and how we use the term. Okay, this is maybe something trivial, but that kept coming up in the discussion. And also the way I structured the whole conference with the help of my colleagues is simply from what we do and the questions that we pose and the problems that we are trying to solve. And one of the aspects which I really liked and which was mentioned already at the very beginning by Maria was the term indigenization. And that came up again and again, also in later papers. But that, as important as it is part of the bigger discussion, which was stressed already in the keynote by Peter van Dommelen. Like this whole discussion which arose from the post-colonial theory, even though we may not have colonies and certain parts of the world that we have been discussing were not touched by this. But what is important to me, and what I would like to stress, is the active approach of the local communities. And that has been repeated basically over and over again in the various papers. And I think that is in the meantime already becoming common. But nevertheless, when I look back at how, when I see myself, let's say 20 years ago, when I came to Troy, and when I remember the discussions which we had back then about the Mycenaean pottery there, and how it was totally clear to everyone that the Mycenaeans were there, and there were the varios, and there were the tradesmen, and the ships were coming, and you name it. It was everything there. And even though I remember that, I was like, but how do we want to prove that? But I had no idea. And it is an incredible relief when the pendulum maybe went into the other direction, and we don't treat these things so literary, and maybe we are wrong, but it's an incredible relief that I'm not forced to explain why the 20 graves at Beşiktepe were the Mycenaean tradesmen, and why already the people at Troy were God knows what, and this kind of stuff. So at least for me, it was a complete revelation. And when I discovered the whole post-colonial discourse, and in that sense, I have to acknowledge Heidelberg and the discussions which I had there with Josef Maran, with Philipp Stockhammer, but also with Diamantis. And these topics caught up, obviously. So I'm a bit out of breath. Would anyone wish to continue in this line of thought? Maybe Peter van der Molen as a keynote.
Yeah. Well, let me again begin as I did on Monday, thanking you, Peter, for the effort to not only have organized this, but keeping it all together over these days. You know, constantly sort of pulling back, and I think as you're doing now in your final comments as well. I think the point is sort of what you called epistemological, the sort of conceptual element. I think that's helpful because what I was struck a little bit, the sort of how little in a way the term agency came up. It was sort of mentioned a lot of time, but nobody really sort of went into it or sort of was talking a little bit. At the same time, other terms were floated, things like interface, translation, the last few days came up a little bit. A lot were these two very detailed network analyses, which are precisely the sort of approaches that I think that blur the whole issue of agency, which was actually, I think, late this morning, that was actually a comment that was made. And I think it is precisely that sort of more focused attention on agents in those specific social situations that we're looking at. The communities, not necessarily individuals. I think that's very difficult with the sort of material we deal with. If we want to really pay attention to that local or indigenous dimension that you just highlighted, Peter. So I think that's that might be a good point. You know, several of these terms, they were throughout these days, there were several comments, oh, we need to come back to that term. And I'm sort of not sure whether it's going to be, would be very helpful to say, if we say interface, translation, or, you know, which other ones we've had and sort of go into them sort of one by one, that's perhaps not the sort of most helpful because it depends on the sort of things you're really specifically interested in, the questions you're asking, or even the sort of materials you're working with and the context. But I think there's a broader element, whether the focus is more so squarely on, you know, this notion of culture and material, what are the relationships between it, and where do the actors, where do the people fit in that picture? That's, I think, sort of the higher level question that everybody's been touching on in one way or another.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was somewhere in my notes, the agency and the missing. But it's also interesting how, because we don't have to see the agency everywhere, but it's also the various types of discourse that we have. And some of the discourses do work more with it and some less. And as a side note, recently we have been co-editing as an institute, and more specifically Jan Kisela, a volume on the AFEAF, the big Iron Age French conferences. And as I was flipping through the book, I noticed that basically each and every paper had distribution maps in it. And so I was like, Jan, like, is it something without any stupid comments? I was like, just like, is it common? Is it always like this, that you have all these distribution maps? And he was like, yes, now when you ask, yes, that's the way we do archaeology, which I found interesting because I had discussions about the use or not use of distribution maps with my colleagues from Berlin, respectively the old Berlin School by Bernhard Hensel. And they actually couldn't imagine having a paper without a distribution map, and which is again not bad, but I was like, okay, but that kind of shapes the questions you ask, because it's only certain questions which you can answer with the distribution maps, and then there are other questions which then somehow stay aside. And so it was again interesting to see which of the papers in this conference were using the distribution maps and which weren't. And it was not that many, but that's not the point. But again, it's about the traditions of how we do things, and I'm sure that Bogdan would say something on this. I will try to do it this way.
Herr Professor, I don't want to be your student. Well, this is not very. I spoke all the time. I feel
Okay,
really bad. Do you want me to speak
sorry.
also in the? Do you want me to speak also in the discussion? I think people are already tired from my voice. This was my first online conference, not Zoom, so I have million hours of Zoom as you do, but the first I liked it very much. I liked very much the 3 hours in the morning. Of course, doing emails or so, but constantly thinking about the papers from the last day. So I think that even when we organize real life conferences, we should give some free time, but not free time you can spend with people or looking at museums or watching Prague, some kind of free times. You can think about the papers from the last day. What I missed are the after parties, because of course, after the third beer, you say things which you don't telling on the floor. This is not a code to get 3 beers now and start speaking like in a pub. We need both type of way to speak, but yes, there are so many people who did speak a lot. There are interesting things to hear from them, and that's what I miss. And this comes to to remind us that, of course, objects which travel in ports or foreign, with all the problems of these topics, of course, they bring information about authority, about different worlds, but it's not the same as meeting people, as human mobility, because of the lack of emotional ties, because of the lack of information. So all these nice terms like enchainment, very often used in Balkan prehistory, people connected through objects. I will reconsider this a little bit. But I pass the microphone to other people. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking of objects, recently there was a discussion on Facebook somewhere about the new term, which was objectscapes. Like that we have seascapes, there is objectscapes, and some people hated it. I found it interesting. I didn't read any paper on the objectscapes, but I can imagine that in certain aspects, but certainly not as an all-embracing approach, such a term could be useful. But one term which has not been mentioned at all, and I wonder to what extent it would fit this discussion, is my favorite term, fuzziness. That the things are fuzzy, like not exactly 0, not exactly 1, but something in between. And I see a certain potential for this fuzzy approach, especially when we talk about unclear borders, because this is what the fuzziness is partly about, that you transit from one region into another, and the border is not completely clear. So there could be something fuzzy about it. What I also liked and noted was a term mentioned by Kerstin Hoffmann, and that was failed romanization in her case, but it could be failed anyizations. And that again caught my attention. I don't know how to use it, but I'm sure I will give it a second thought because that is also somehow linked with, let's say, technologies. Like certain technologies arrive, but if the accepting side is not somehow able to grasp them properly or to read the translation, to use the favorite word, then such a transmission can fail. And that's also something that we should be paying attention to. I don't know, Kirsten, would you like to comment upon this some more?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for organizing this conference, because I think we came in a dialogue really about a lot of different traditions, a lot of different practices, methods, and this is, I think, one of the main ideas I take with me. That's I think the analysis of dialogues are of importance. That we, after a long time looking from one side or from one area, we really have to go into more discussion about this kind of stuff, to switch the scales, to get concepts together and not use and discard or develop their own idea only, but really go into a discussion. And this is failed harmonization. I have some problems with the term because it's pejorative, failed normally, no? You have a failure or something like that. But there are a lot of different ideas and behind this side, and it always depends on which level you look at it. But there are a lot of things that I normally want to do something, and then a totally different thing happens, and I engage with another person and come in dialogue, and it happens quite creative things. And I think this is the main thing, that we have to look at a lot of different practices, a lot of different ways of dealing with cultural interactions, and that there are a lot of different ways to deal with it, and a lot of different ways to look at it. And and even that I was discussing a bit with a few persons here in the chat, the whole idea of bringing together and bringing into a critical dialogue a lot of ideas on interactions, on the way of dealing with certain ideas. And it's sometimes really quite interesting that sometimes one thinks like influence or ization processes or processes itself, that it's quite not dynamic, that's not so interactive, but sometimes it helps to look at processes and then agency and then practices and interaction. And I think this was a good start for this kind of things in this conference, because it was always in an interaction of different scales and different practices and all and different ideas and traditions. So,
thank you. But when we say about the use of the word failed, what comes up to my mind are these jokes about the British summer, like that the download failed and there is no summer again. But Peter, have you raised hand?
Yes, because I'd like to, all right, I'll put it back again. I'd like to sort of very much support and even take a bit further what Kirsten just said. I think it's the failure part of it, but it is also a demonstration why I think it really would be very good to just forget all about the term Romanization, or only use it to connect to older published debates or something like that, because it's not just a failure, there's also the normative expectation that you will have to become Roman, and if you don't, no, you better go home. Which is precisely, I think, at odds with the whole perspective that Diamantis earlier this morning set out. You know, objects have affordances, and it can go left, it can go right, it can go at a 30-degree angle. In that way, it's sort of there's all these various options, and depend on the social context and the actors and sort of in which they are in, and it becomes a very, well, as I said, normative evaluation if you're going to say, that they became properly Roman, or did they become, you know, sort of how many % Roman did they become, and that's then even before you sort of start talking about actors and objects there. So I think that's a very problematic term for that reason.
Yeah.
Diamantis?
Well, I actually have nothing to add. I'm trying to. I agree with everything actually, and you have mentioned not only you, Peter, but also Peter van Dommelen and Kirsten Hoffman some very interesting terms again. Well, Romanization. I have nothing against this term as a cultural phenomenon. I think the problem is to use this term as an analytical category to understand cultural phenomena, because indeed there must have been some coercive process of imbuing Roman values in the provinces, but what we used to define as Romanization is something much more broader and heterogeneous. Something very interesting, which Peter mentioned, the term objectscapes, might be relevant to our discussions. It is a very favorable term in classical archaeology, and the discussion began with some colleagues who tried to develop new narratives which were independent from the textual evidence. And my reaction to that, of course, it's very interesting to try to calibrate the written evidence by evaluating the archaeological data. My problem is that I'm afraid that, at least in my field, prehistoric archaeology, what we always have been doing was objectscapes, because we have no other possibility. We try to constitute taskscapes or practices almost exclusively based on objects. So I'm not sure whether in some fields of archaeology this could be fruitful.
We shall see. Kavuri, have the raised hands.
Well, we absolutely love the term failed romanization. From numerous aspects, because looking at the rhetorics of, as it was in this moment nicely formulated by Diamantis, we have got this problem of historical determinism in the rhetoric of Southeastern Europe. You have to become Romanized. So every archaeological assemblage demonstrating the opposite, where the Romans really got their heads kicked in, is interpreted in an opposite way, because you have to become modern. This is a historical consequence. And let us turn back now to the epistemology. Although being deep down in my soul an evolutionist, I have the problem with the term innovation, because it sublimely implies an evolutionary development. But that's why should we start thinking about how to use and in which circumstances use the term innovation? Because basically, boiled down to the minimum, it has to imply some change, some optimization of something. Otherwise, it's just a variability, it's just a mutation. And this is how we would like to see the archaeology of Southeast Europe. No, there was a failed, well, there was no failed Romanization, but did we have a failed Hellenization of the Eastern Adriatic coast? Here we can just discuss the concepts, or failed Latinization of the Central Balkans. Here we come to the idea of what is actually the relation between innovation and variability, synchronous variability. This is something I think we should try to address in the future here in the region, at least. Thank you.
Yeah, that's why I was mentioning izations in general. But Francesco, Iacono?
Yes, that was an interesting point. I think we can perhaps try to juxtapose to some extent the narrative of visation in terms of structuring the long-term history of Romanization, Hellenization, and so on and so forth. And what I was wondering, can we think at innovation and replacement of objects as a sort of further hypermodern narrative that tries in some way to create a new normal historical narrative that we can adapt to any kind of archaeological evidence? But this is just a bit of a provocation, I have to admit. But I wonder if someone wants to take it on. No one. No, I'm joking. Kerstin, yes?
Kerstin?
Perhaps I can try it. I worked a lot of about innovation, and I sometimes think it's quite helpful, but it depends on the mode and then how you really get into it. And it's also one thing that we also talked about, it's a qualitative and quantitative approach, and how they are normally separated in our talks. One is doing quantitative archaeology and one is doing qualitative archaeology, and I think it need to be embedded. And like processes need to be embedded with practices and actors more. So I think it depends on how we really narrate innovations and then what is going on. Also, like there's also the term failed innovation, or the problem that with innovation, other cultural knowledge is missing or is not any of any importance anymore and so on. So this whole situation, if you go into more in the details of the discussion about inventations and the social and mental innovations, might be quite interesting to go into these details. But normally we do use Roger Shoemaker, and it's nice to use it because it's a wonderful process and we can fill it in it with statistics and so on. But we really have to go into the modern discussions about innovations, like the question: when do we when are we creative? When do we invent something? When do we have the desirabilities and the irritations to take a new thing into our models and into our thinking and all this kind of stuff? So then it might be interesting, but it's not interesting if it's only a process and we use it like diffusion or an ization that is not really going into deep description, I think. So you can combine it, I think, with your ideas of desirability and incompatibilities also. Quite interesting sometimes with innovations or inventions, if they are and if there are irritations and so also. I think it might be interesting to go into this direction.
Okay, thank you. Peter van der Molen?
Yeah, Francesco, would you want to, well, or I'll actually sort of, I'm not quite sure I understood you correctly, but I think sort of innovation, the sort of, it's a term that's used a lot, and sort of in particularly in terms of artisanal practices, sort of think about pottery production and so on. But I think there's the problem, there is this evolutionist expectation, and it's a modernist term in that sense. And because I don't think, if you think again about pottery, sort of if, say stopping to use a fast potter's wheel and start produce fine handmade pots in a context which also has fast wheel produced ones. I don't think many of us would term that innovation, and I think that immediately in itself demonstrates that there is an underlying sort of expectation within that term, and that of course is somewhat problematic. But at the same time, this is also one of those terms that's sort of so ingrained in our discourse, and it also sort of just demonstrates we all come from that. Well, that's our modernist society, and so that's or postmodernist society, but still that's a problem.
If I can briefly come back to this point, I mean, I agree. I was thinking explicitly at the intertwinkling to some extent of new materialism, actor network theory, and this kind of idea of innovation in a way that can be, there is a clear intellectual root that goes back to the modern contemporary industrial production setting that has that sort of inclination, so to speak. So I wonder if we embrace too cool this kind of innovation-led perspective, if we are to some extent sort of legitimizing to some extent perspective like that. But it is a broad intellectual issue, I think, but just to clarify what I intended. Yeah.
Diamantis?
Well, on innovation, I think it's an important, promising issue in the archaeological field, because it's one of the key issues in modern discourses outside academia. And in this case, I am very confident that archaeology can make an important contribution, which would be relevant not only within, but also outside our field. Innovation is a very interesting subject to explore, to try to answer the question, for example, the invention of writing. Was this the result of brainstorming of a group of officials in a palace, or the idea of an ingenious individual? Was this the result of external influences? And there has been in recent years some innovative approaches to understand how the potter's wheel enters several cultural regions, why there was a reaction to the potter's wheel, why its adaptation was immediate or very slow. I can understand the skepticism about the term, but I find a very promising field of inquiry. And especially if we can show as archaeologists that the interaction with other cultures, the open borders, can play a very important role in innovations. The main way to understand them, not only in antiquity, but also in later periods, is the shift of function or the shift of significance in objects. And innovation is almost never something totally new. It's something which is transformed, and we have so many examples in modern times, but also in antiquity. It is this shifting that creates something totally new.
Thank you. There was Marek wanted to say something. Bogdan has an idea. Who is more urgent?
I have only a short remark to this question about innovation and the idea that this term, in the meaning as an innovation, is a modernist term, because there was a discussion in the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years concerning the artisan production in the first millennium BC in ancient Greece, especially the bronze casting and bronze production. And Gerhard Zimmer could show really clearly that this term innovation was, on the one hand, already mentioned by Herodotus in one story, as the one messenger came to Sparta and speak about the Athenians and their innovatory approaches to several things. But he could also show that regarding the bronze technology, we see these innovations, but they are running parallel to the traditions. So that this innovation is always depend on the workshop, on the master, or how do we call this? So it doesn't mean, and this was also one thing we tried to show in our paper, that even if you are speaking about the introduction of iron as innovation, it doesn't mean that it totally push out the bronzes as the original idea of Anthony Snodgrass in the 70s was. So as a short remark to this discussion.
Okay. Bogdan still?
Yes. So if I dare to quite simplify what Francesco said, actually it was, do we want to rethink something completely legitimate in order to write on a new way, which means in order to create innovation. So I see a dialectic in what you said, because you want to deconstruct innovation in order to create a new way of thinking and writing about archaeology, which is an innovation. And I think that this conference has the chance to happen in a very good time in, if you take the history of ideas, because first the dirty job has been done 10, 20 years ago. We don't need to criticize any more classical concepts such as archaeological theory, romanization, center and periphery, and so forth. We are not throwing them with the bathwater, but we don't need to criticize them anymore, which is pretty good because this takes intellectual. On the other hand, there is this pressure anymore as at the time of Foucault or so to offer a new grand narrative. Now, guys, we should absolutely tell you what borders 3.0 are, or contact spaces 3.0. Here we have to produce the new generation of how to think about these topics. This is also pretty good sort of liberty. So we can relax. We can choose between different theories, starting from Marxism, Weberism, whatever you like, offered today in a much less aggressive way than theory was at the time when Ir Hodder had to establish post-processor archaeology and to fight, and there was broken jars and so forth. And just relax, look at our case, and take what works for us. So I think this is really a good time to work on these topics.
Yes, thank you, Bogdan. And I would say with these liberating words, we should bring it to an end. So thank you again to everyone for these incredible 4 days. And as they say, we shall stay in touch. So have a nice Friday and the weekend. So thank you again and take care. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you all. Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you.
I'll be the last.
Thank you.
We won't let you to go. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Ciao.